Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Vampire October. Today we bring you a sad and forlorn tale of Generation X, the story of lost teenagers in a world before the internet, searching for something, anything, that would give their lives meaning and purpose, and who found vampires and murder. This is the story of Roderick Justin Ferrell and his cult of Kentucky teenage vampires.
Let's begin. Prologue: The Vampire and the Teenage Girl. The vampire had been asleep for 5 centuries, calling on the elders from the vast void of darkness, cursed with immortality, and had now awakened. He'd been turned in 85,000 BC, when only the rawest form of humanity existed. Primitive beings in fertile plains, naked scavengers just learning to hunt. He'd roamed ancient Greece and Egypt, read from the great library of Alexandria, then watched as it burned. In the 1400s, he'd been part of the aristocracy in France. Then, forever growing tired of life and dreary of the humans he was cursed to feed on, he laid down his physical coil, letting that manifestation of his earthly being rot back into the earth, and had slept for centuries in only spiritual form. But now he'd rematerialized in the flesh, taking the form of the ultimate rebel, an American teenage boy in 1997.
The vampire had been called on by Lucifer himself to take vengeance on America for their sins of greed and corruption, taking the physical manifestation of a boy named Rod Ferrell in Murray, Kentucky, a town with no alcohol, famous for its Boy Scout museum, and having the world's largest roller skating rink. After Paris, Egypt, and Greece, this was the final destination for the ancient vampire.
The vampire stroked the face of the teenaged girl in the graveyard, Heather, mesmerizing her with his eyes and speaking to her in a low, throaty whisper.
Lest mortals destroy themselves with their own hate and greed, I have been cast on this land. I am the devil's child walking with earthly feet. I can smell your blood, my fledgling, not like the foul stench of the vampire blood, but the blood of innocence.
The vampire gazed into the eyes of the young girl, surrounded by pale gravestones like the crooked teeth of a grinning skull. Today was the day he'd make her immortal, make her part of his clan, his vampiric family.
Will you give thanks to the gods of the undead? Are you ready to join them?
Heather's heart beat heavy and fast as she nodded. Yes, I give thanks, and am ready for the embrace.
Her vampire savior had returned, just as he said he would, coming to rescue her and take her away from her awful, boring life in Florida.
When Rod left, a huge void had opened in Heather's life. No one was as intense, dark, or intelligent as him. He'd quote her Shakespeare and Plato, tell her about Satanist Anton LaVey's warnings on the dangers of psychic vampires. She'd missed him so much.
And now, he was here again, promising to whisk her away from her judgmental, conformist parents and off to New Orleans, where they live life amongst the other vampires.
The furthest Heather had ever been was Disney World. She felt so trapped here in this cookie-cutter suburban realm and longed to see the world, to escape and run free.
Spanish moss cascaded down from the overhanging branches of an ancient oak tree, dripping down and covering the gravestones. It was a magical place, a place they called the birthplace, where the pavement ended and became grass, where two realms merged, that of the living and the dead. A place Heather and Rod had often met at before Rod had moved back to Kentucky.
Heather would tell her parents she was staying after school to watch her big sister's cheerleading practice, then sneak off to the graveyard to meet with Rod, long before he'd dyed his hair black and begun drinking blood.
Heather was a bright and gifted, all-A student, as well as an artist. So her wealthy parents usually let her have her way. Her mom had said it was cute when she dyed her blonde hair purple, then orange, and eventually black. Then everything black. Black, 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 when the rest of Eustis, Florida was dressed in white. White polo shirts and white Bermuda shorts.
But lately, her parents were trying to be so controlling. She was just over it. Over it. Everyone got upset over the stupidest things, like the Barbie she'd mutilated, hung from a noose and attached to her backpack. It was just a joke. It wasn't even her Barbie. A friend had put it in her locker to be funny. Of all the things to get upset about, a mutilated Barbie hanging from a noose?
Heather was only 15 years old, couldn't stand the idea of 3 more years under control of her parents and her school and her church. She couldn't sit around and wait until she was 18. She'd rather die. So she called her dark prince and begged him to take her away. Just get her away from her stupid parents, this stupid town, the stupid people.
It seemed as if everything had been leading to this point. Everything Rod had taught her over the years. The rituals and incantations, meditating on sacred symbols so she could penetrate their secret meanings in her candlelit bedroom, using healing crystals and divination tools like runes and tarot cards for prophecy. He'd taught her to build her astral body, using ceremony and incantation to evoke a medium that allowed her subconsciousness to rise up. And then she'd project it to far-off realms and past lives.
But he'd always warned her, forbidden knowledge must be given slowly. Immortality is no easy task. And then he'd tell her, I can astral project myself onto a throne in hell as easily as I can project my image in the mirror.
Rod told Heather she'd been a witch who'd been burned alive at the stake in a past life. But now her destiny awaited in New Orleans, where they would live in a mansion on Royal Street. The convent Alucard, a vampire hangout, where he knew a prince that would welcome them.
The vampire took the girl's long, pale arm, ran his face along it, inhaling deeply of her scent, pausing to press his lips to the blue veins, snaking upwards like tiny rivers. Carefully, he placed the blade of a razor on the soft, white flesh of her arm, then quickly gave a slash the thinnest of slits opening, a crimson rose slowly erupting. Then he put his lips to the cut and drank of her.
When the vampire had his fill, he pulled up his own sleeve, taking the razor blade and slicing in that same soft place, a tiny nick, just enough to get the blood flowing, saying,
"Partaketh of the nectar."
Heather fell upon it, sucking his ancient blood, like a beautiful teenage mosquito.
Oh, my writing is funny. When they were done, they kissed briefly, intermingling the blood and spit.
In some ways, it was a passionless kiss, as Rod had sworn his love to another, Charity, who sat not too far away waiting in an old Buick Skylark they called the Shitbox, the rest of Rod's vampire family with her, Scott Anderson and Dana Cooper. And Heather, too, had a boyfriend. But he was a jock and a preppy and couldn't understand her vampire obsession, though she'd begged him to join her and run away as well.
Rod said. "We must get going. The rest of them are waiting for us."
Okay, Rod, you're not going to kill my parents, are you?
No, not unless you want me to.
What happened next is disputed. There are several versions out there. According to Rod, Heather had been asking him to kill her parents for months, calling him collect, saying they were abusive, that she couldn't stand living there, saying she wanted them dead.
Rod claims Heather said they could also steal her parents' SUV, and that she had unlocked the doors from her garage into her house, giving Rod and his best friend Scott open access. But Rod is a notorious liar and would change his story many times over the years.
According to Heather, the plan was just for Rod and his vampire clan to swoop her up and take her away to New Orleans, where they'd live in a castle like royalty. She claims that though Rod had offered to murder her parents numerous times, she'd always emphatically said no, and that there was never a plan to steal her parents' SUV, and also that she was completely unaware that Rod and Scott even went to her house after the bloodletting ceremony.
But what we do know for certain is that Rod didn't know anybody in New Orleans, and he wasn't a vampire. He wasn't immortal, he couldn't read minds or divine the future. He was just a budding sociopath, his anti-personality disorder exhibiting itself in violence and cruelty to animals, as well as a need to dominate and control, to manipulate through any means necessary. And within hours of turning Heather into a vampire, initiating her in what they call the embrace, a sharing of blood, Roderick Justin Ferrell would enter the home of Heather Wendorf with his vampire sidekick, Scott Anderson, and he would cave in the heads of both her parents with a crowbar. That is a fact.
The story of the teenage vampire cult murders would make headlines around the world, leaving the world to wonder who was this vampire killer and what had led him to kill.
Chapter 1. A Vampire is Born.
Roderick Justin Ferrell was born on March 28, 1980, in Murray, Kentucky, to 16-year-old high school sweethearts Sandra Gibson and Rick Ferrell.
After Sandra got pregnant, the teenagers quit school and got married. But soon after Rod's birth, his father abandoned the family and would never return. And Rod would never know his father at all.
Sandra, a teenage mother, struggled to get by working as an exotic dancer and sex worker, and became heavily involved with drugs. And little Rod was often left in the care of his grandparents for long periods of time.
Rod's grandparents were strict evangelicals who deeply disapproved of Sandra's wild lifestyle, and the sentiment went both ways. For Sandra would tell Rod he didn't need to listen to them if he didn't want to, that they were hypocrites and full of shit.
The family dynamic was bizarre, and Rod claims that when he was 5 years old, his grandfather took him out on a fishing trip and raped him. Rod would say,
"My childhood was taken away at 5, and I don't know whether I'm sleeping or dreaming. For all I know, I could just wake up in 5 minutes."
Rod would also say often that he despised his grandfather and wanted to kill him. In fact, as we'll see, he may have actually tried.
When Sandra would show up at her parents' house to whisk little Rod away again, sometimes a weird tug-of-war would erupt, and she'd argue with her father, then scream at him that she was going to pay one of her drug connects to come and murder him, all while little Rod sat there staring wide-eyed.
For a while, Sandra dated a New Age guy who called himself a warlock, and she involved Rod in their candle-burning ceremonies from a very young age. Sandra also had a love of the Gothic and horror, and introduced little Rod to the movie Dracula, and he loved it and was soon obsessing over horror comics.
There was just something about vampires that Rod connected to on a primordial level, being alive but dead, living on the outside of society, a stranger looking in. Not human, but a beautiful monster. And humans, just silly things to be fed on.
Sandra bounced around, heading down to Orlando, Florida for a while, settling down in the nearby town of Eustis.
Rod's love of vampires evolved into an obsession with the occult, and he collected artifacts and books of hidden knowledge along the way. Crystals, candles, and runes, the Satanic Bible, the Book of the Law, and the Book of Lies by Aleister Crowley, and in particular, Buckland's complete book of witchcraft. In fact, he got very into aspects of Wiccan nature worship, spellcraft, divination, as well as reincarnation, but he never lost his love of vampires.
It was then that Rod had met Heather. There was a little group of them into the occult, including Rod's girlfriend at the time, Janine, who was all into white magic, searching for fairies and drinking herb tea, rejuvenating from the healing energies of trees, gazing in crystal balls, and prophesizing with tarot cards. But Janine was a Christian, still happily going to church with her parents, and Rod relished quoting scripture at her, flaunting his knowledge of the Bible, saying it was her goodness and light that kept him tethered to the earth. Otherwise, he'd fade away, a cloud of darkness.
Your life is hard, yeah, I understand. I felt the same, like I just didn't belong, but there's a party.
Rod lived what he called the freak life, wearing combat boots and a black trench coat, growing his strawberry blonde hair out long, often wearing a comically tall striped top hat, akin to the Cat in the Hat, giving him the look of a goofy wizard of sorts, and a dark wizard was the impression he sought, relishing his eclectic knowledge of the occult and lording it over the other teens at his high school, feeling he lived a million lives to their one, dreaming at night of sorcerers and demons and vampires.
Sandra was open to it all. She was very much the cool mom, and even allowed him to spray paint a pentagram on the floor, paint his room black, and keep shards of glass in the corners to ward off demonic entities. She encouraged his love of metal music, a crossover from her Black Sabbath to his Marilyn Manson. But then he'd started getting into drugs, doing cocaine at 14 and going crazy, screaming he was an ancient demon. The demon Visago, a goetic demon in the occult book The Lesser Key of Solomon, the third in command of the spirits of Satan's army of rebel angels, according to occult belief, and possessed special powers such as fortune-telling.
Rod got his hands on some LSD and came to school tripping, and got expelled in the 9th grade.
At this point, Sandra had had enough. While he was out, she went and got rid of all his black sheets and replaced them with yellow floral patterns, redecorating his whole bedroom in yellow.
Parents, if you have a goth kid, please don't do this. It will only make it worse. When Rod saw what she had done, replacing everything black in his bedroom with yellow floral patterns, he went wild. He said he was going to kill her, grabbed a knife, and chased her about the house.
In 1995, Sandra and Rod moved back to Kentucky. Little Rod was 15 years old, but in his mind, he was a wizard and a demonic being as ancient as time itself.
Chapter 2: The Trench Coat and the Cloak.
Murray, Kentucky is a deeply religious town. They call it the buckle of the Bible Belt. There is actually one church for every 300 people.
Murray is also a dry town. No alcohol, no bars, but it is home to the largest roller skating rink in the USA, Circus Skate.
Sandra rented them a little apartment, and Rod enrolled in Callaway High School, where he knew some kids from elementary school, Scott Anderson and Matt Goodman. Rod proudly displayed his book collection and deep knowledge of ancient mysticism and esoteric lore, proclaiming his astral self could manifest itself as a 9-foot demon.
Rod would teach them sword tricks and the use of a knife and chalice and magical rituals, chanting spells from his books of magic.
Matt was a Christian, though, and would tell Rod that to worship the devil is to admit the existence of a more powerful god. And Rod would counter that 666 is a human number according to the Book of Revelation, and to worship the beast is to worship humanity.
Then Matt would bring up the 10 Commandments and the sin of having other gods, and Rod would say, "I don't care what god you worship, I'll destroy him in my mind."
How are you going to destroy God with your mind? Matt would ask.
I can pierce this reality and reach realms of external existence, defy the laws of time and space, and draw on the power of hell's fire. Crumble your God in my palm, for nothing is more powerful than Lucifer and his legions.
Matt thought Rod was full of shit. Matt liked playing Dungeons and Dragons and reading Tolkien, but he didn't take it seriously. Rod acted like sorcery and magic were real.
But Rod and Scott, they formed a strong bond. Scott was a misfit with dark, greasy hair and thick glasses, a nerd with a bad complexion from a violent home, who'd been abandoned and bounced around to different foster homes, often running away. Rod himself had bounced around the country, being abandoned himself as well. So they understood each other and understood how fantasy could be reality as a means of coping. On a deep subconscious level, they understood that reality is whatever one perceives it to be. And if one can convince themselves of something, that makes it reality. And they felt the hope in that, the necessity in the face of a real world too horrible and hopeless to face.
There was only one problem to Rod's arrival in Murray. All the damn vampires.
All the goth kids and vampires hung out in a crumbling old concrete structure in the middle of the woods, covered in graffiti, called the Vampire Hotel, where they'd play the role-playing game, Vampire the Masquerade, and act out their vampire fantasies. And then after that, they'd all hang out at the local Hardee's, drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes until 2 a.m. I remember Hardee's. Do you ever have Hardee's around?
No, I don't think so. But I'm not sure because I do recognize, I've definitely heard of it. Yeah. Kids drinking coffee all night is kind of weird to me because it was definitely just booze where I grew up.
We used to drink coffee all night at the Denny's.
Wow.
Smoke cigarettes. Because you had the bottomless cup and the ladies would come by. Are you going to buy anything to eat? No.
Nope. The head of the vampires was a guy who went by Jaden. His real name was Stephen Murphy. He took the name Jaden from a Star Trek The Next Generation episode, which it might be the nerdiest thing ever, seriously.
Really is, man. The whole vampire thing in Murray, Kentucky had actually started at the local college with the tabletop role-playing game Masquerade the Vampire that had come out just a few years earlier. It's basically just Dungeons and Dragons with vampires set in this gothic punk rock world. And since it was a dry county with no bars or alcohol, the local college kids would smoke weed and play this vampire game, sometimes also dropping acid or eating mushrooms.
Soon the local high school kids were playing as well, and they took it to new levels, changing it from a tabletop game to a live-action role-playing game, or LARPing, physically acting the game out deep in the woods. They became so obsessed, they began to see it as reality, developing their own vampire mythos, cutting each other and sucking each other's blood.
It was really just nothing else to do in this boring little town, and they became lost in their fantasies. Fueled by the grunge and goth culture of the 1990s, Marilyn Manson and Nine Inch Nails, Jaden began telling his friends that a mysterious Englishman had come to Kentucky and sired him, making him a vampire. And now the ancient blood flowed in his veins, and he had the power to turn others with the embrace.
As Jaden's girlfriend Ashley explained, the intentions of the vampire game was to have fun. The other intention was to have a family. We were a family. It was a place to belong. It was a place where you could go and be loved and not be judged. You could be yourself. And blood drinking? Well, blood drinking was a spiritual thing. You were able to have a piece of your friend with you forever.
Jaden, who was a very imaginative and dramatic guy who dreamed of being an actor, Jaden started his own clan of vampires, becoming everyone's father, including his younger brother Scott, aka Gabriel, who was only 14 years old and also a member of the vampire group.
I could be anyone. I could do anything I please. I could go anywhere, but I can't seem to find a way to leave. I don't need anyone.
Jaden got his own place, a little house, and they'd all hang out in the tiny basement, the stone walls painted black. It was like a crypt in the tight confines, and they'd act out their vampire fantasies, becoming the characters they'd created for Masquerade the Vampire, convincing themselves that it was all true.
Jaden was famous for wearing a black cloak, and when Rod showed up in a black overcoat, a wizard in this town of vampires, well, it seemed like trouble, and everyone thought they were gonna fight.
Yeah, the whole school thought there was going to be a fight because Rod wore an overcoat and Jaden wore a cloak. It was to be the battle of the wizard and the vampire.
But that's not what happened. Much the opposite, in fact.
Chapter 3: The Wizard and the Vampire.
Rod and Jaden found they had much too much in common to fight, and instead, the wizard and the vampire bonded as brothers of the occult. They'd both had supernatural experiences with witches and ghosts, and they were both very well read in occult literature.
Jaden told Rod how he had been made a vampire by a mysterious English gentleman, how he had drank his blood and gained immortality, had discovered new magical abilities, like reading minds. Jaden said he could read Rod's mind, could see that he was wise and passionate. Jaden claimed that he was 2,000 years old, and told Rod that they'd known each other for centuries in past lives.
Then Jaden offered to teach Rod the true vampiric ways, to indoctrinate him into the vampiric way of life, the true way that separated myth and legend from reality, and to let Rod join his clan, his vampire family. Jaden offered to be his sire and give him the embrace, allow him to cross over, and Rod accepted.
Jaden explained, quote, "The embrace, whether it be male on male, female on female, is sexual. It's the taking of one's fluid into your body, the joining of souls and spirits that have walked the earth for thousands of years."
The vampire and the wizard went to the old Salem cemetery, sat on a tombstone, cut their arms open with a knife, and drank of each other's blood.
Rod was now officially a vampire. He dyed his long hair black, painted his nails black, carried razor blades with him, and cherished the act of bloodletting, of both being cut to feed and suckling on the bloody wounds of others himself. He used magic to channel his ancient past lives, where he'd also been a vampire, and realized vampirism was his destiny.
But right from the beginning, there were issues and a simmering resentment.
For one, Jaden was a Christian and claimed to use his vampiric supernatural ways as a means of goodness and spreading light. Jaden thought every human life was sacred and considered murder a sin.
Rod, on the other hand, openly worshipped demons and devils, considered Christianity the height of hypocrisy, and believed he'd been put on this earth to bring about the apocalypse and the collapse of humanity, which he was sure would happen in the year 2000.
One day, Jaden and Rod were walking along a dark path through the trailer park where Jaden's mother lived, when they heard the high-pitched meowing of a kitten.
Rod spied the creature, a little black fur ball with yellow eyes, and lifted it up, but the tiny cat scratched him. So Rod, without blinking an eye, took it by the tail and smashed it against a tree, shattering its spine.
This bit of cruelty was too much for Jaden, who said it showed an utter lack of respect for life, and he began to sever his ties with Rod.
Tensions were now high in the vampire clan, and Rod would erupt into violent fits, demanding that they chop off his head with a sword, put him out of his misery, saying demons were feasting on his spiritual flesh, describing seeing his skin sizzling in a skillet in the fires of hell.
Jaden would just laugh at him, call him a fool. But it all came to a head when Rod told Jaden's girlfriend, Ashley, that he'd like to cut her open and smear her guts everywhere so people could see them, saying he could kill the whole vampire clan as easily as he'd killed that kitten.
At that point, Jaden stopped laughing and grabbed Rod by the throat, slamming him against the fence, strangling him until his face went purple.
Rod claimed he didn't fight back because if he did, he surely would have killed his vampiric father.
And the police were actually called over this incident, and because Jaden was 18, a legal adult, and Rod was only 16, a minor, Jaden was arrested, and a restraining order was put in place.
Rod was now officially expelled from the vampire family. When they would gather at the Hardys to eat French fries and gossip, Rod was no longer allowed to be with them and would sit on the other side of the restaurant, casting menacing glares.
Chapter 4: The Dueling Vampire Clans. Now an outcast from Jaden's clan, Rod starts his own vampiric family, called the Vampire Clan, which is really not very imaginative at all.
First, he embraced his childhood friend Scott Anderson. Rod gives him his bleeding arm to drink from and became his sire.
Then Rod embraced 15-year-old Michael Schaefer, turning him into an undead blood drinker as well.
Then Rod was able to lure young Charity Kesey, a good friend of Ashley's, away from Jaden's circle.
Charity was an only child and lived with her father, her mother having moved to North Dakota.
Charity's father was always working, and she'd often felt alone in the world, and felt the pull of darkness and ancient spiritual practices. Exploring her heritage, she'd studied Scottish Druid culture, which led to Wicca and various forms of magic and witchcraft, and eventually the sacrificial use of blood. She felt she'd met a kindred spirit in Rod. The two would take long midnight strolls through forests and graveyards in the moonlight, holding hands, pledging their love to each other. Rod saying,
"Now and forever, let us stay in love and as love, and every minute and every hour know that I love you. We are bonded more than the angels are bound to God. You are my queen, the only sweet thing in this cruel life. You will be seated next to me eternal. You have already let your body die, and soon you will leave the weakness of mortal desires behind. You will feel no need to hold on to your silly childhood playgrounds. You will be flying over the fields of your youth, watching from the air in amazement."
and Charity brought her 19-year-old goth friend Dana into the clan. Dana was a misfit who loved Marilyn Manson. A bit dumpy and lost, with short frizzy hair, just looking for any escape from her dull life in Murray, Kentucky.
But, seriously, if you're 19 years old and hanging out with 15 and 16-year-old vampires sucking on their blood, maybe it's time to re-examine your life and try to make some adult friends.
Rod was now their vampiric father and had a full-on vampire clan of his own. He taught them his views and what it meant to be Nosferatu, unclean living dead, scoffing at the idea of fangs and sleeping in a coffin, saying a true vampire was not one who slept during the day, but during the daylight of consciousness, explaining that to be enclosed in unconsciousness, that is the coffin.
To be a vampire is a psychic endeavor, Rod preached, and to become undead was to become poltergeist-like, capricious and mischievous, devilish ghosts. He'd then lament how easy life had been in the 1400s when killing strangers would go unnoticed.
Meanwhile, Rod's mother, Sandra, also became obsessed with real-life vampirism.
Sandra is often described as having the mentality of a 12-year-old. Rod says he never really considered her a mother, but more of a best friend and companion.
Now Sandra is dressing all in black, practicing spells, and asking Rod to turn her, to give her the embrace, to let her drink of his blood and make her a vampire. Which, remember, is an overtly sexual process, and all involved in this vampire business claim being a vampire made one hypersexual. Nearly all of them were polyamorous and bisexual.
It's said Sandra had long behaved inappropriately around her teenage son, sometimes wearing lingerie and posing provocatively in front of him.
But Rod thinks his mother is unworthy, is a poser, a loser, and refuses to give her the embrace, to turn her and become her sire. So Sandra sets her sights on another vampire, Jaden's 14-year-old brother, Gabriel.
Sandra sets out to seduce the 14-year-old boy. She builds an altar to him, decorated with photographs of him surrounded by candles. She casts love spells and starts writing him steamy letters in hopes that he will turn her.
Just to recap what you're hearing, Rod's 32-year-old mother is actively trying to seduce a 14-year-old boy in hopes he will make her a vampire.
Some fucked up shit, man. She's writing him these letters, and these letters, they read, in part,
"You may be very young, but you are fine. I think about being French kissed and fucked by you all the time. I hope that doesn't upset you by my feeling that way. I long to be near you, for your embrace. Yes, to become a vampire, a part of the family, and truly yours forever. I dream of you crossing me over while you're getting off. I'll wear my blue denim sundress, and we could kiss for a while. Then while we're kissing, I'll unzip your pants and go down and lick you and suck you. Then I'll pull my dress up and move my panties over and guide you inside me."
Sandra even mails this young teen the key to her apartment. But the letters were then discovered by Jaden and Gabriel's mother, who was already very fed up with all their vampire antics.
Gabriel's mother was, justifiably so, disgusted and horrified, and she turns the letters over to the police. And on November 12th, 1996, Sandra was charged with soliciting rape and sodomy of a minor.
And now, when tensions, drama, and bizarre intrigue between the two vampire clans couldn't get any higher, someone breaks into the local animal shelter, lets all the animals loose, and disgustingly mutilates several puppies.
It is a truly disgusting and horrible act. Some of the puppies had their limbs torn from their bodies. Others looked like they'd been kicked and stomped into the ground.
The rumors were that it had been a vampire ritual and that they'd rubbed the blood all over their bodies, though it didn't really look like a ritual. There was no altar or candles, just some puppies scattered in a field next to the animal shelter.
Of course, Rod is instantly suspect number one, but Rod vehemently denied being involved, saying he was with Charity that night, even going into the sheriff's department, his long jet black hair parted evenly in the middle, wearing blood-red lipstick, and telling the sheriff that he had nothing to do with the heinous slaughter, that he was completely innocent, and outside forces were trying to frame him.
Rod tells the sheriff he was just misunderstood, that vampirism was a spiritual path for him, and that the small Kentucky town were all prejudiced against him.
Chapter 5. The Escape of the Vampires.
The houses on the old block are glowing. The children dressed up in masks. And me, I'm not afraid of this raw vodka in my kitchen glass. I wonder what my family does tonight, in a crowd all clinging to a cross. Me, I'm not afraid of Halloween or this line that I've crossed. These monsters and spirits don't scare me much, when what I fear the most is that trickster, that bully, that stole my family, the fucking Holy Ghost. The frames in my head filled with photographs.
Rod and his little clan of vampires desperately wanted out of Kentucky.
Charity wanted to move to Oregon and be a beautician, thinking Rod could be an artist. Rod and Charity began telling people they were married, vampiric man and wife, and Charity claimed she was pregnant with their little vampire baby.
Whether Charity really thought she was pregnant or just trying to get attention and using the idea as a way of settling Rod down isn't known, but she was definitely not pregnant.
Rod wanted to go to France and join the ancient aristocracy he'd once been a part of in past vampire lives. Scott wanted to go wherever his best friend Rod went, and Dana wanted to be anywhere but Murray, Kentucky. Literally anywhere besides the miserable little town that made her feel like a complete loser and outsider.
Finally, they settled on New Orleans, where Rod claimed he'd lived back in the 1700s. Rod would sigh over the beauty of the black wrought iron banisters and wooden shutters, and said he'd be contacting voodoo queens and witch doctors to consecrate his favorite cemetery so that he could begin the coven's formal vampire training.
And in a page right out of Twilight, he told them there was a cold war between vampires and werewolves in New Orleans, saying Lupine territory covers everything east of the Inner Harbor on the north bank of the Mississippi, but from the Inner Harbor west to Williams Boulevard is vampire territory, warning them never to venture beyond Bayou St. John.
All the while, there were the phone calls from Heather, hundreds of them. She'd call and lament about her sad life in conformist suburban Florida, calling Rod so much that her parents forbade her to make any more expensive long-distance calls. So Rod told her to start calling him collect at Scott's house, racking up $2,000 in phone bills.
Oh my god, that makes my poor little 90s kid heart, tremble in fear. Did Heather ask him to kill her parents during these calls? Or did she just ask him to rescue her and take her away with him to New Orleans? That is the question that is still asked to this day.
Rod had Scott write to Heather to start a relationship with her. These letters are incredibly awkward and sad. Scott telling Heather how he was a virgin in order to gain more psychic powers, vowing to be her spiritual protector. Heather writing back saying, "Aw, that's nice." Rod and Scott even performed love ceremonies to psychically join Scott and Heather.
And things are getting very weird in Murray, Kentucky. More and more kids are getting into goth. The sheriff is flooded with calls about witches' covens performing rituals in the forest, devil worshippers performing animal sacrifice. Sandra appears to be losing her mind. She's calling the sheriff and saying that ghosts and apparitions are attacking her. At one point, she calls and says there's a decapitated goat's head in her bed. But when police arrived, they saw it was just a mounted deer's head lying on her bedroom floor.
One day, the vampire clan were hanging out in Rod's apartment. While Rod dozed, they were attempting a fire ritual incantation and accidentally set the curtains on fire.
When Rod awoke to see the blaze going up, he just laughed as the others frantically worked to quell the fire.
Things aren't getting any easier. I know. But in the golden of the evening,
Then Scott managed to get his hands on an old Buick Skylark, but it ran like hell. They called it the shit box and didn't know if it would even make the long trip to New Orleans.
so far away. Seen the end. But the only thing I really need is you here. Who can keep still?
But Rod's grandpa had a nice Jeep. A Jeep Rod had his eye on.
And as the day of their departure came closer, an odd event transpired with Rod and his grandfather.
Rod called his grandfather and asked for a ride over to a friend's house, far out in the Kentucky hills. As they were driving, crossing a deserted bridge in the middle of nowhere, there was Scott blocking the road with his Skylark, the hood up as if he was having car trouble.
"Pull over, Grandpa," Rod said. "We gotta help my friend Scott."
But Grandpa, sensing a setup, was like, hell no, and whipped around and started heading back to town. When who comes roaring up behind him but Scott, his car suddenly running fine.
Grandpa stepped on the gas, and Scott stayed right with him, getting dangerously close. All the while, Rod fidgeted with something in his jacket, which Grandpa thought was a knife. Grandpa sped through town and right to the sheriff's station, parking and telling Rod to get the hell out of his Jeep. Grandpa then went and reported the entire incident to the sheriff.
The very next day, on November 25th, 1996, Rod dropped a 10-strip of golden dragonfly acid, and the clan took off in the Skylark, headed for Florida.
Chapter 6: The Road to Murder.
It was a brisk November day in Florida, the breeze coming in cool off the lake, when the bell for her last period rang in Eustis High, and Heather stomped through the locker-lined halls in her combat boots, her long hair dyed jet black, hanging in her face, through the crowds of the conformist preppies that would never understand her, out into the late autumn afternoon, to see her vampire savior standing there on the sidewalk, a wry grin on his face as if he'd flown there on leathery bat wings.
Rod, being the 16-year-old cult leader high on acid that he was, dramatically stated that she needed to decide if she was joining their vampire family or not. If she decides to join them, she needs to dedicate herself to the vampire clan, to take the embrace, become one with them, and feed off his ancient blood.
And Heather was all about it, and skipped off to the graveyard with him, eager to suck his blood.
After the ceremony in the cemetery, Heather climbed into the Buick Skylark to meet her new vampire family for the first time.
First, she's met with Charity, who proudly proclaims she's Rod's wife and is pregnant with his child.
And then she finally meets Scott. She'd been writing to Scott for months now. He'd basically pledged his love to her. Rod had described him to Heather as a warrior prince, darkly handsome, a master of martial arts, and a man of knowledge.
Heather was pretty crestfallen to see a frail, acne-faced, and incredibly awkward nerd in thick glasses with a sad wisp of a mustache.
Her new sister Dana wasn't that impressive either. She seemed gruff and cold, older, and too cool for school, with a chip on her shoulder.
The teens take off in the shitbox, rattling along, headed to Heather's house so she can gather whatever earthly possessions she wished to take with her to Vampire Land.
Heather went inside and packed 2 small backpacks with clothes, grabbed a sketchbook and her beloved teddy bear, and left a note to her family saying,
Dear Mom and Dad, I don't have much time, but I must say that I love you all so very much. I'm leaving for good, and I don't want you to worry about me because I will be fine. Please don't try to find us. Just know that I'll miss you and will always love you. Heather.
Then she ran out through the night to where the car full of vampires waited for her.
Now, here's where we can only speculate.
According to Rod, he had instructed Heather to unlock the doors to her house, which she had done. And she knew that Rod and Scott were then headed into her parents' home.
According to Heather, she thought Rod and Scott were cutting through the woods, headed on foot to Rod's ex-girlfriend Janine's house, where they would meet them after first going to see Heather's boyfriend.
But according to Rod, he instructed her to leave the doors to the house unlocked, which she did. Did Heather unlock the doors to her home to let the vampires slip inside? We just don't know. Regardless, as Heather, Charity, and Dana headed to Heather's boyfriend's house, Rod and Scott crept through the night and up to Heather's suburban home.
Rod and Scott circled the house, peering in windows, ascertaining where the occupants were situated. Naomi, Heather's mother, was in the shower, and Heather's father, Richard Wendorf, was napping on the sofa in front of the television.
They crept over to the garage, Rod pausing to scrawl 666 in the dust, then went around to the side door, which was unlocked.
Again, the question, had Heather unlocked it? If so, she gave the vampires permission to enter, which they did.
Creeping through the garage, Rod gazed at all the potential weapons. An axe. No, too unwieldy and stereotypical. A chainsaw. No, too loud. Then he eyed the perfect weapon. A heavy crowbar.
Then the young vampires entered the home through a series of doors that were all unlocked, from the garage to the laundry room into the kitchen. They crept to the living room where Heather's father slept on the sofa in front of the television.
When Heather's father began to stir, Rod cracked him in the head with the crowbar to knock him out. But then, he claims, he panicked and decided then and there to just beat him to death, bludgeoning him in the head 20 times, knocking teeth and skull fragments across the living room and into the dining room, cracking his skull open before stabbing him with the flat end when he, quote, wouldn't stop breathing, sinking the flat end of the crowbar between his ribs into his chest and piercing his heart.
Scott just stood there, stunned, and watched it all go down.
But then, to ease the tension a little, Rod talked Scott into doing a death dance around the body to celebrate. And they did, dancing around merrily before who should walk out of the kitchen but Heather's mother, fresh from the shower, wrapped in a robe, holding a steaming cup of coffee in her hand.
Seeing this insanity, her husband sprawled on the sofa with his head crushed in, and two strange teenaged vampires dancing around the body. She throws the coffee in Rod's face, leaps on him, and begins clawing at his eyes.
And as they stumbled around in this strange embrace, Rod proceeded to bash her in the back of the head with the blunt end of the crowbar until there was, as he puts it, quote, a big old hole there.
With both of Heather's parents dead, the two vampires headed to the master bedroom, where Rod grabbed a pearl necklace, a Discover card, and the Ford Explorer keys.
They took off their shirts, trying to wash the blood off themselves, then hopped into the Ford Explorer and drove out into the night.
Heather, Charity, and Dana, meanwhile, had gone to Heather's 15-year-old boyfriend's place, where Heather tried to convince him to run away with her, telling him she had no choice but to leave now that she'd crossed over and been embraced, become a vampire. He is this preppy jock, and he thinks they're all freaks, and flatly says no. No, he's not running away to live as a vampire in New Orleans. He also says he'd like to have some words with this Rod character.
Heather claims they were then supposed to go get her friend, Rod's ex, Janine, and Heather says she was utterly surprised to see her parents' Ford Explorer come racing up with Rod and Scott in it, both shirtless. And when Dana followed in the Skylark, headed off onto the highway without Janine, Heather claims she had a panic attack and began demanding that they turn around and take her back. The girls just kept following the Ford Explorer into the night.
Heather's older sister Jenny would come home to discover the bodies of her parents and frantically called 911. Soon the house was swarming with cops, and both Heather's boyfriend and her best friend Janine were giving statements to the police about how Heather had run away with a group of teenage vampires from Kentucky.
On November 27th, arrest warrants were out for Roderick Justin Ferrell, Charity Lynn Kesey, Howard Scott Anderson, Dana Lynn Cooper, and Heather Ann Wendorf. They were considered armed and dangerous.
Chapter 7. The Road Trip from Hell.
Eventually, the caravan pulled over and the Buick was abandoned, everyone hopping into the Ford Explorer. Heather saying her parents were going to kill her when they found out that they'd stolen their car. Charity coldly saying to her,
"Don't worry about your parents. Your parents are dead."
Heather claims this is the moment when she first realized her parents had been murdered.
You are looking very sexy in your boots. When they're undone, then we shall see if I'm the one who knows your truth. Let's turn the music up and play the songs we like.
They went to a Walmart the vampires bought Little Debbie cakes and Doritos, paying for them with a Discover card of Heather's daddy.
They then drove and drove into the night, the miles streaming by, until the SUV ran out of gas.
When the Explorer began to putter and stall, they thought the SUV was breaking down at first. Didn't even realize that it was out of gas, because they're fucking idiots. Rod then hiked off to find a gas station, leaving the vampire clan on the side of the road with the Ford.
As the reality that her parents were most likely dead settled on her, Heather told them she felt weak, as if she were dying, and began to shake violently.
Scott told her this was just part of the crossover, part of becoming a vampire, and that she needed to feed.
"Yes," Charity exclaimed, "let me feed you." Charity then pulled up her sleeve, sliced open her arm, and offered the bloody wound to Heather, who feasted upon it, saying yes, yes, the blood did make her feel so much better.
Scott told her, "We are Rod's offspring, awaiting our new birth, one that will bring us to the home of the dead."
Then Rod was back with a container of gas, and as he poured the fuel into the tank, the spiraling red and blue lights of a police cruiser cut through the night, pulling up behind them, and two officers approached.
Rod talked to the cops amiably, laughing and grinning, saying they were college students from Texas.
The cops laughed back, told them to be safe and have a good night, and they were on their way without ever even asking to see Rod's driver's license.
And that is some serious vampire mind control shit right there. What the fuck?
They found an empty house and broke inside, stole 2 piggy banks of change, a bow and arrow, some Oscar Mayer hot dogs, bread, mustard, and a couple jugs of juice, and the teenage vampires drove onward.
Chapter 8. New Orleans. The vampires had made it. They were now in New Orleans, the Big Easy, the vampire capital, the most haunted city in the world, where it said the dead refused to rest.
They headed right to St. Louis Cemetery, the resting place of voodoo priestess Marie Laveau, so that Scott could prove himself to Heather by holding a ceremony. First, they performed a ritual of walking, covering the outside of the cemetery in a circle. Then, beginning from the north and to the east, they marched, their tracks forming the outline of a great star, ending at the main gates of the cemetery where Rod awaited, his arms outstretched, the black trench coat making him appear like a dark angel as he called out to the ghosts of the graveyard to awaken the demons of hell before slicing open his hand and smearing his blood into an upside-down cross on the stone gates.
They jumped over the cemetery wall and read from H.P. Lovecraft's The Necronomicon, just like the San Luis Obispo death metal kids we covered a few weeks ago. It's so weird that they read from these books of fiction.
I know, right? Rod called Heather his hellish queen and conjured dog-faced demons, messengers of the gods of prey, to hasten their departure, saying,
"You have taken a vow. You have become my child and have been with me always as my eternal child. You have been with me since Doomsday 65 million years ago. And today you will discover the ecstasy of the underworld."
And Heather? Well, Heather found herself laughing in his face.
They had no money. They were almost out of gas and food, were wanted for a double homicide, and were in a strange place where they knew no one. Still, it could have been a wonderful time. There's like a ton of gutter punks and crusties and squatters and anarchists in New Orleans. They could have found a place amongst all of them, a home. It really could have been everything they wanted it to be, if not for those pesky murder warrants hanging over their heads.
Then the crew were by the Mississippi River, and Rod was ordering them to discard all their personal belongings, to be free of the past, to rid themselves of earthly ties and give thanks to the gods of the underworld. It was here that Rod finally tossed the crowbar, the murder weapon, into the black waters.
They stumbled through the New Orleans streets, drinking red wine from the bottle, when two police stopped them. Rod smiled and told them they were from out of town, visiting his cousins, and they'd gotten lost, and then asked the police for directions. The cops told them to be careful. They were entering a rough part of town, and gave them directions back to the Mississippi River.
Heather, who'd later claimed to have been kidnapped, again did nothing, as for the second time police were within earshot.
Then, on Thanksgiving Day, Charity called her mother in South Dakota and asked her to loan her some money, hoping she hadn't heard of the murders. But she had. Everyone had. The teenage vampire desperados were worldwide news at this point.
Charity's mom told her she'd wire her some money, and Charity said they were near a Howard Johnson's hotel and to send it there. Charity's mother then promptly called the police, who raced to the hotel where they found the dirty but draggled crew, squatting dejected in the hotel parking lot, hungry, lost, and forsaken.
The vampires gave themselves up without a fight.
Put in a holding cell together, Rod and Charity passionately kissed, making out as teenagers do, swapping spit and vowing eternal love as they waited extradition to Florida.
Chapter 9: The Vampire Trials. Rod hammed it up for the press, making demonic faces and sticking his tongue out at their cameras. And he confessed immediately, saying, "Let my children free. They had nothing to do with it," before describing in grisly detail how he caved in the heads of Heather's parents with a crowbar, famously saying, "When I killed those people, I felt a rush. I felt like I was God. But if I was a god, I guess I wouldn't be here today, would I?"
They all talked. Charity said she knew of the plans for murder, that it was premeditated, and had tried to talk Rod and Scott out of it. Dana said the same thing. Scott even confessed that he was supposed to kill Heather's mother as part of the plan, but just froze and couldn't do it.
But Heather claimed she specifically told Rod to not kill her parents. She says she told him their ghosts would haunt them and they'd be psychic baggage. She claimed there had been no plan for either murder or to steal her parents' Ford Explorer, and that she had basically been kidnapped, saying she hadn't wanted to go with them if her best friend Janine wasn't coming as well. But by the time she discovered Janine wasn't coming, it was too late. She was in the ship box, barreling towards Louisiana.
But several of Heather's classmates say Heather told them out-of-state vampires were coming to kill her parents.
One of these girls was named Amber Blood. What a name, man. This whole story, fuck. For a while, Amber Blood was considered a star witness, and she gave statements to the press that were published far and wide, and Heather was fully condemned in the media.
But then Amber failed a polygraph test, and it came out that Amber had never even met Heather before, and she admitted she made the whole thing up.
And it appears that everyone who said Heather had told them she planned to kill her parents was lying, and they didn't even know her at all.
But it was too late. The media was having a field day covering the teenaged vampire cult.
But while Heather was being vilified in the press, a grand jury was hearing testimony from Heather's boyfriend and all her best friends, all of them saying Heather had told them, yes, she was running away, but she had never mentioned killing her parents, that they thought Heather loved her parents, and the grand jury came to believe she was completely innocent, and no charges were brought against her.
Heather Wendorf was then released, completely free. No charges were ever brought against her.
While Rod was awaiting trial, his mother, Sandra Gibson, went to court and was sentenced to probation for the sexual letters she'd mailed to 14-year-old Gabriel, asking him to turn her into a vampire.
Rod ended up pleading guilty to the murder and robbery charges and threw himself on the mercy of the court, hoping the sentencing hearing would elicit sympathy from the jury.
His aunt took the stand and claimed that she, too, had been molested by Rod's grandfather.
Jaden took the stand, blew Rod a kiss, and said he still loved him. Jaden said he was the closest who had ever come to being a father to Rod. He then pulled a Valentine's card from Sandra from his pocket and said she was still actively trying to join the vampire cult. The card was taken into evidence.
Rod's father came, took the stand, referring to him only as the child. It was the first time in his life Rod had seen his father, and he broke down in tears at the sight of him. It would be the only time during the trial that Rod ever wept.
And it was the fault of so few, that so many have it so tough. so her fires they'll burn, even when Belia is gone. And I, for one, believe.
Sandra took the stand, saying he was a good boy with a horribly sad and troubled life.
But if all the testimony elicited any sympathy from the jury, it was erased when the grainy black and white images of Rod joyfully confessing to the murders was played. Rod laughing and describing in detail how the brains of Heather's mother leaked from the hole in her head.
On February 12, 1998, Rod was given the death penalty, becoming the youngest person on Florida's death row at the time, living in an 8-foot by 6-foot cell, literally 8 feet away from Old Sparky, the same electric chair that had taken the life of Ted Bundy, among many, many others.
In subsequent trials, Scott was given life without parole, Dana 17 years, and Charity 10.
In November of 2000, the Florida Supreme Court reduced Rod's death sentence to life in prison without parole.
Dana was released from prison in 2011, and Charity released in 2006.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Roderick Ferrell and the Kentucky Teenage Vampire Cult. We hope you enjoyed it.
Happy spooky season, everybody. Happy Halloween. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed our Vampire October.
Happy Halloween!
And I really want to thank all the amazing bands that gave us music this week. It is simply incredible. There's links to all their music in the show notes. Check them out. We'll start with Something Wicked, local Humboldt County, California hardcore punk. Love these guys. Something Wicked. The Red River Riot, good rock and roll. They gave us music for the Elsie Poller episode a few weeks ago. Love them. Laws Rabone, English jazz, some really good stuff. Thank you, Laws, for giving us Bewitched. I loved it. Satyada, that is a vegan black metal band. So if you're into vegan black metal, check out Satyada. Boiler Beach gave us a couple songs. Good Canadian punk rock. Austin Maffa, Mother Witch, Halizna, I really love Halizna, Keshko, Kira Daly, and Surat. So thank you so much to all of them. And we're going to let you go with a song by Something Wicked called Breakout.
Down, we gotta take that step, and we'll stand it all around. Right now, I wanna hear you shout, motherfucker, can't have it now. We won't take this, we won't stand for it. We sit back and watch from the sidelines. We survive instead of the violence. Here's how you can free your mind, break from the lies they tell. Straight from this hell made up of spells. No more turning back to watch them attack. No one coming back for you. Break out, our time is now. Gotta take that down, and we'll stand it all around. Right now, I wanna hear you shout, motherfucker, can you hear me now? Break out!